Okay, so and this is actually one that we will discuss, but I'm going to start at the top and then it kind of cascades down and it kind of describes the system and how it's delivered. But the first is a good system. Anything that we do, it should be resting on a good theory. A good theory that drives a method that drives techniques that drive practices, and practices that create or comprise the system. So the first one is asset, and that's one that we will talk about today. So I will definitely explain exactly what asset is and why it's important. If you take asset away, we have to start all over. I wouldn't be able to deliver this system without asset. That's one of the absolutely most critical components. And then from asset, I'll draw a little line. We get to, and I will explain what all of these are. I'm just going to write them out now, and we kind of described this, I think, more last week, but it's basically what we call the third pillar. And I'll get into that. But that is the primary method. One of the things that I've done is and I don't know if it was intentional or accidental or just one of those things, but I've really created this much like a martial arts system would be, well, not all martial arts systems, but some. Some will have a lot of structure, a lot of tangibility where you can really see where all of this stuff is coming from. Some of them not so much, but yeah, we're kind of mimicking one of the ones that do. So the third pillar drives what I call the 6 techniques. So when we're doing this mindfulness system, when we're sharing it with other people, when we're doing it ourselves, we are never doing more than these 6 techniques. And I'm not going to type them all out right now. We'll talk about those over the course of the training. Definitely a part of the substance of the matter, but we have the 6 techniques. And I actually just thought of something really important to add to the slides. Donna, don't let me forget. Don't you love it when people say that? Especially when you're a forgetful person and they're telling you to not let them forget. It's like,
No, I'm good at it. People
oh,
always
you
tell
are?
me that.
Oh, good. Okay, don't let me forget, even though I've probably already forgotten. And then the 6 techniques drive the myriad of practices. So an example of a practice would be like fox walking. Fox walking is a very simple mindfulness walking practice. It will contain the 6 techniques. It is based on the third pillar, and it all is driven by this theory, this fundamental theory that we'll talk about today. There's more practices. I have 100 practices. I was writing them all out yesterday, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got a lot of practices. Because the individual practices and then practices are driven by what we call tools. The tools would be like the individual points of perception, the individual points of attention, because they're shared. If I'm hiking, that's fox walking, I'm kind of paying attention to trees. Sometimes I'll look out windows and things and then pay attention to trees. So a tree being a point of attention is a tool that can be consistent across many different practices. Of course, if Donna's in her house right now and, no trees are visible, she might have to activate some imagination, or just trees aren't her tool right now. Does that make sense? So if we're ever delivering this practice or talking about this practice or doing this practice and it's not all leading back that cascading branch thing that I've made, if it doesn't lead back to asset, if it doesn't lead back to the third pillar, it's not this practice. Does that make sense? It's not the bridge. It could be something else. It could be wildly beneficial. I don't know, but it's not this. One of the reasons I've done that is because sometimes things, I think Tai Chi is an example where it's just not clearly defined. Everybody has a different idea of what it is or what it should be or what it isn't. And it's like barbecue and religion. Everybody thinks they're right and nobody can agree. So I've kind of taken that into consideration in creating this system. If you take these elements away, it is not the bridge. It's that simple. If you take the embodiment factor away, then you're just doing mindfulness-based stress relief, which is amazing, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is cool. But again, it wouldn't be the bridge mindfulness system. Does that make sense? Any questions about any of that so far before we get into kind of newish material? None of this will be new for you, Donna, but leaves too much room for interpretation, waters it down. It can, absolutely. If you remove the embodiment factor, it ain't this. I mean, it's just that simple, right? It would definitely water it down.
And the tool that I use to know whether I'm doing that or not is how it feels.
And we'll talk about the lens of perception. You know, that's in the spiritual community, that's one of the most unreliable things is how you feel, because the lens of perception, it's not very clear. It is consistent of all of the different attachments and overthinking and desires that come from places that we're not even sure of sometimes, because the unconscious mind is collecting things without their knowing it. And when I say unconscious, I don't mean this in any, you know, mystical way. I mean below the level of recognition. And we've talked about that. The human mind, and then we'll get into the principle of balance, and I can explain how this fits in too, but the human mind is constantly operating above and below recognition. They used to call this subconscious, but this wording has changed in the psychology community. It's now referred to as below the level of consciousness or below active recognition, because subconscious is kind of something that got a little bit weird. You know, Freud started and other psychologists started to make claims about subconscious that just they couldn't really prove, you know, so it never really, it didn't stay in the mainstream psychology. So right now I have active points of attention, and then there's also things occurring that are below my level of active recognition, but my mind body is still perceiving it. Does that make sense? Yeah, so like if, you know, I use this example because it was one of the first times that I was like, wait, what just happened? But I was just out of high school, and I was cleaning a fryer, and some of the grease splattered on the coils that heats the fryer, and it went in up to my eye, but my eye blinked. Of course, that's a reflex, but I'm like, well, I get the word reflex, but what is going on? How did my mind, my vision, I had to see it, you know, it had to have been perceived visually, even though I wasn't really looking at it. So that kind of launched me into, well, what's really going on and below and above active recognition? Does that make sense? Super simple. Okay. Ida, any questions before we go on? Basically, when I say that, yes, Donna, please, that's just an excuse for me to get a drink of coffee.
And I'm
No,
I'm getting coffee too. I just waved at
sorry.
Ida.
Sorry, I'm just listening in today. I won't really be able to talk very much, which may be a blessing.
Oh no, stop that. That's not a blessing. We love to hear from you, Ida. And there'll probably be a few more people joining as we go along. But I guess we're at 6:13 now, so I better get going. We'll let Donna come back, and then we'll jump into the stuff. But William, I've designed this system much like how martial arts would be taught, but also the things that I don't like, I've changed. So if a person wants to teach this, they have to do it. That's just the bottom line. It can't be an information-based thing. A person has to be doing the system to share the system. So that's just a non-negotiable thing. The way that a person is, you know, allowed, or, you know, I mean, anybody can teach anything. If you're doing it, you have the authority to share what you're doing. I can always share my practice with whoever I want. I typically accredit whoever taught me that thing. Like you guys know, when we do Superman, I always credit Joshua, but I don't have to get Joshua's permission because I do that every single day. So I'm just sharing what I do every single day. I'm not sharing their system, if that makes sense. But so if Donna wants to teach this system, when she does, and when it's time to, it's basically the teacher gives the blessing to teach, that type of thing. It's like, okay, you've learned what you need to learn. I feel comfortable with you sharing this material. It will never be a certification factory. It can't. But it's also not like master apprentice type of thing, because there's so much uniqueness. Donna can invent new practices. She can't really alter, you know, some of the stuff before that. You can't take away the embodiment factor. You can't take away asset. You can't take away the individual techniques, but she can create practices all day long. You know, we all live different lives. We have different interests. We're in different communities with different, you know, diversities that are going on around us, and we'll come up with different ways to interact with our environment, and that can breed new practices. So, you know, if Lauren scuba dives, she could create mindfulness practices around scuba diving, and it can be a scuba diving practice that's under the Bridge banner. Does that make sense? So the things that I didn't really like about certain teachers in martial arts is, of course, this is Burger King. This isn't Burger King, and it has to be my way or the highway. And if you want to teach it, you have to teach it exactly how I have taught you, with no deviation whatsoever. And I don't like that. So I took what I liked from it and left the rest, I guess. Does that make sense? Yeah. So some things can't change, but it still leaves a lot of room for wild diversity, which I didn't really have in Tai Chi. I told my teacher I wanted to practice with my backpack. He said no. I'm like, why? I wear my backpack everywhere. He's like, it's not traditional. I'm like, oh, here we go. All right, that makes sense, Donna? Any questions? All right, so let's jump into it. I do have a little bit of a PowerPoint. It's not super finished yet or anything. I plan to do some refinement as we continue to share this. Remember, the system has 4 primary layers. I do believe that Donna is qualified for sure, and I think others are as well, to share the first 2. I think that Donna, when she's ready, could also share the 3rd. There's nobody really right now that's approaching sharing with others the 4th layer of this practice. But we are talking about it, and I think that that's amazing. So one of the ways that this system is delivered is, and I guess we kind of talked about this last week, it's a lot of it is through question and answer. One of the principles is, when you ask the question, it means that you're ready to receive the answer. If questions aren't even occurring to you, sometimes information that's being thrown at you, it's not being stored, it's not being processed, it's going in one ear out the other. It blows your mind for 15 minutes, and the next day you're back to doing whatever you were doing. You know, you have that, oh my God, this is the most amazing information I've ever heard in my life. Tomorrow it's completely forgotten type of effect. And I've seen that before. I've talked to people about mindfulness and they're like, Ernest, you've changed my life. And then 2 days later, they've completely forgotten about all of it and they're not doing any of it. And I'm like, really? Interesting. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into that. So I guess we talked about the teaching formats last week, and I can go over that at the end, like the different ways that this is delivered. And it's pretty common, I think, in teaching styles. But the Bridge mindfulness system, we'll just jump into the very first one, ASSET, active and selective sensory engagement theory. And then I'll go over each word and and I have actually a whole booklet that if anybody wants a link to, I can send you a link to the ASSET booklet. It needs a little bit of updating. Some of the verbiage is a little bit old, but so if we took this away, I got nothing. I mean, all of the practice may still apply, but I can't share it. Not with the mind that I have. It requires this. So this is a theory, and the reason it's a theory is because you can do it. So you can feel it empirically in your own experience. And there are ways to experiment with another person so that you can demonstrate it to a group. So this is theoretical, and by the way, I'm using the word theoretical the way that the scientific community does. Theoretical means that experiments have been done, that there are multiple lines of data, meaning completely different experiments are still yielding the same result. That is theoretical. Hypothetical is your best guess. We haven't really tested it. We're getting inconsistent feedback. It hasn't crossed the divide between hypothesis to theory. Something becomes a law when it is just absolutely irrefutable and you start to build other scientific premise from it. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the word theory is used wildly incorrectly in common language. The biggest one is conspiracy theory. That's just totally wrong. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not even a conspiracy hypothesis, because a hypothesis is supposed to be a logical deduction. And most conspiracy theories aren't even usually logical. So it should just be conspiracy talk is what it, yeah, I think that makes sense. So we'll start with the first word. Gigigobi Igarubup. What's that? I don't know what that is. That, oh, I don't know. What is that? Did you just accidentally did your cat jump on the keyboard?
It's gobbledygook.
Oh, googly gop. Okay. That is definitely googly gop. Hey, Shayna, if you're listening and have a second, may I have a coffee refill? If not, I can grab it if you're not. I don't know where she went. Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so asset. The first one is active. It means that it's happening now. It means that this theory that we're talking about is a part of the present moment. It's not something that is just being processed to memory. It's not a concept that we just put in our mind. It's not just a good idea. It's something that is occurring thusly. That's super important. So active and selective. Basically what this is saying is that the human mind under normal conditions, so the system doesn't really approach what psychology would call abnormal psychology. I have no evidence to support that this particular system is good for certain things with abnormal psychology. So I'm not even touching any of that. I think over the next 20 years, maybe we'll be able to do some experimentation to get some evidence-based that the bridge is great for ADHD, or the bridge is great for other like more severe forms of abnormal psychology, like severe obsessive compulsive disorders, but I don't have any data to support any of that right now. So under normal conditions, and I'm putting that in air quotes for sure. So under typical normal brain conditions, the human mind is able to actively select, and this is the fun part, engage. And we'll talk, engage is to maintain emphasis or to vary the way that you interact with a point of attention. And of course, in a previous, and we'll go over all this again, but what is attention? The mind's ability to isolate from its available data, which is being perceived through our senses. Your vision is available data, what you smell is available data, and of course there's a little bit more, but we're just sticking to the primary five. We'll add introspection and stuff like that. So this basic theory is saying that under normal conditions, a human being is perfectly able to actively select and engage their sensory perception. So before we continue, would we all agree that that is true? As a human being, you have the ability to actively select, emphasize, and maintain emphasis on any aspect of your available data. If it's unavailable, we can't talk about it because you don't know.
I agree, and I would think that the common mind thinks that they're doing that all the time. Of course,
They do.
It's an obvious explanation, and I am choosing what I look at. I'm
Oh, yeah.
choosing what I do. I just made
Oh,
my
for
cup
sure.
of coffee, but so much of it is not selective and it's mindless. It's situational. It's as it comes up.
You're
Yeah.
right. And what have we added to the system to help, dissolve that erroneous self-hustle? What about this system helps to alleviate the potential self-hustle of course, I'm doing this deliberate, I chose to drink this coffee, Donna. I'm doing it deliberately. What is the best way to make sure that it's deliberate in the beginning?
Decide beforehand what we're going to do all day.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be all day. You can alternate, you can have different things, but if you selected it in advance, you cannot hustle yourself. And you'll notice how much more difficult it is than just, oh, I'm totally aware, Donna. Like I chose to sit here, I chose to listen, and I chose okay, that's not what we mean, you know, that I get it. You did make these choices, but what we're talking about is actively selecting sensory engagement in the present moment. And of course, in this system, in the beginning, the best way to do that and not hustle yourself is to determine those points in advance and do your best to remember them throughout the day. You can't
It was
hustle
the thing
yourself.
that I did last, and it was it was ridiculous. It was stubbornness on my part. I thought,
Mhm.
I can do this. And I would be well into the day before I realized I'm not really doing anything. I'm
Right,
forgetting it and forgetting and remembering and very little remembering only because I haven't chosen anything and it became wishy-washy.
exactly. Yes.
And I'd
Well,
like to add
Mhm.
that also, I think, like you said, you can't hustle yourself, but I think that the common term, I'm in the present moment, is just, it's a very vague statement. And so when you
It is.
start creating a point of attention, you realize present moment isn't just being that I'm aware of the space I'm in
Mhm.
in a very broad sense, because we
Right.
go in and out of that so often. But yeah, when you create a point of attention for the day, that really defines, are you in the present moment, as opposed to, yes, I'm not wildly thinking of my past, or I'm not completely focused on the future. I think that's how people think a lot of times about present moments. So
True.
having a anchor like that
Yes.
really transforms like your awareness of, oh, no, I'm not in the present moment because I'm not even managing what I said I was going to stay focused on.
Exactly. Yep. And incidentally, it will be the number one reason that people quit. That will be the reason that people quit the system, is because they will start to find it difficult. We had a lot of people from different backgrounds. A lot of them were like very, I'm putting this in big air quotes, spiritual. You know, it was a lot of law of attraction. It was a lot of different groups. And when they had to actually do something that they couldn't, you can't deny, if you chose to look at something in particular or to listen behind you, like we do in like we do in Zhenjuan, you're either doing it or you're not. And to do it and to remember it, they feel like it requires something, and that it requires too much, which it
It's
doesn't, of
defeating
course.
for some people. I think that's what it. Some people get defeated very easily
That's
when
true.
they have certain disciplines they have to manage, and that's
If
It's
you
not.
do it, if you do it, I think people will argue that they're doing it when they're not. I think the example that we used a lot was driving. I could
Yes.
drive home from work and I used my brakes at the right time. I used my steering wheel at the right time. I didn't crash into anybody, but sometimes I would appear in my driveway and I really was going to go shopping after work and pick up some groceries. And I'm in my driveway and I have really no active recollection of anything particular. I don't remember what the scenery looked like. I don't remember. I didn't look for my friend's car in the driveway because I promised I would give her a call and I wanted to see if she was home or whatever. It was a mindless trip home because I was thinking about past or future or conversation or whatever. I wasn't actively engaged in the present moment, even though I was able to drive my vehicle, which requires, a significant amount of attention, but not, there was less attention on the present moment than I would ever admit to
Mhm.
until I actually did the practice and realized how mindless I was being during the course of a day.
Yes, and it's a great example, and it can lead into an excellent discussion on the concepts of memory. Because when we're driving, we're using muscle memory, motor memory, and we're using active, they don't call it short-term memory anymore. It's active, active memory. So you don't have to relearn how to use a steering wheel, and you have long-term memory, you know where you're going, so you know how to get there. And it's the perfect example of, you can be doing all of that, you can get to your destination, and you can be thinking about shit the whole time, the entire time. That's actually how a lot of people, and I'm just going to say a lot, I don't want to put the entire species in a box, but there's a lot of people that are living their whole lives like that. They're almost, their entire life experience is like a water hose that's just shooting off everywhere, and it's all basically anatomic. It's happening based on conditioning, habit, and of course, all of that is going through what we call the lens of perception, which is going to influence desire. It's going to influence basically desire, and that's one of the main things. Does that make sense?
yeah, that's marketing 101, desire.
Yeah. And See, the interesting thing is when the more we do this practice, the more that it's embodied, as it accumulates, our lens of perception starts to clear because there's less words going through it and we're interacting with our environment. So the lens of perception starts to clear up, and then we can actually start to see which desire is just a derivative of that mindless anatomic state that I've been in, and which desires are not, such as this will be a whole nother discussion, and it's actually a really important point of one of the books I'm writing, but there's all of these other aspects of our cognition that we could be interacting with. So outside of thought, imagination is a really good one. You know, we can interact with our imagination. The human being, and again, this I don't know for sure because the nature of perception is uniquely individual. I don't see a lot of animals with active imagination like we have. We can superimpose imagination over the present moment, and we can even remove ourselves from the present moment and project images into the future or just completely made up. That's why Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge, because you don't need knowledge to imagine something that you've never thought of before or seen before. And that's a human characteristic. I really believe that we should embrace those human characteristics. Again, dolphins may be doing it, birds, I don't know. But in general, I have no reason to believe that my dog has a very active imagination. Sorry, Neo, but I have no evidence to support that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because his desires show his lack of imagination.
It does. It does. All right, so let's get back into, so is asset pretty clear? So we have active, selective, sensory engagement theory. It's a theory because theoretically, under normal conditions, every single human being can do this. If they couldn't, we don't have an embodiment mindfulness system. I don't know what we have. Okay.
One quick question.
Yes.
On the active portion happening now, that just refers to things that are in your present area or in the environment that you can pay attention to.
Well, it does, but let's say that you want to actively imagine a flower for the rest of the day, even though there's no flower in your environment. So active more means that it's being done. You're doing it right now.
You're doing it. Okay.
You're doing it, whether it's an imagination technique or a humor technique or a creative technique. And I think that's where I was getting to, is that the human being loves to create. So it's a universal human desire that we enjoy the creative process. So a desire that maybe isn't inspired or is coming from an automatic mind could be a Ferrari. You know, where did that desire come from? Why do you really want a Ferrari? You know, and there may be reasons, you know, maybe somebody just, they love the detail of a vehicle and they love how it drives and how it feels. But still, when we start to get to the difference, we can see which desires are coming from a mind that is not deliberate. And if it's not deliberate, it's a condition, it's acting on conditioning. I mean, it's doing one or the other. So either the mind is operating conditionally or it's operating deliberately. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And also, things around you, it's not only external points of attention that we use, there are internal points of attention. So
Absolutely.
even if we were in a white room with not a lot of stimuli, we could still find points of attention internally. Our breath, our feet on the floor, our alignment and our posture, things like that. So it doesn't only have to be what's around you.
True. Yeah. And because I'm an imperfect human, I don't like the word internal with martial arts. It's so irritating because it's like, well, what are you talking about? Explain internal. What are you doing internally? Tell me how you're perceiving your internal bone marrow. I would love to know the physiological explanation as to why something like that can be perceived. Maybe it can. I put that in the island of maybe, but I'm not getting any real understanding of how it's done. However, we know that we sense into the body using what's called the peripheral nervous system. And if a person is in a car accident and they're severed from the neck down, they lose their ability to connect with that peripheral nervous system, and they no longer can sense their body. Basic body awareness is what I'm talking about with internal. So the only reason I'm making that distinction is because when I talk about internal, I can describe it physiologically. I can tell you exactly what's going on, electrochemical, physiological, and hormonal responses from the peripheral nervous system communicating with our central nervous system, traveling to be processed by our brain. So when I put my hand up, I can perceive it because the nerves are there. I'm paying attention, and I can sense in using the peripheral nervous system. So when I say internal, I don't always, and of course you can start to sense organs. The more that you pay attention, the quieter you are, you start to feel certain things going on. But I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole when I say internal. Internal is just using your peripheral nervous system to sense that you have a body. And you can even find different points, Dantian, or I've really been using acupuncture points a lot. So if you want to pay attention to K1, you can pay attention to K1.
The breath in my nostrils is cooler when I inhale than when I exhale, and I can focus that as a point of attention.
You could.
I
Yeah,
don't need anything outside of me to do that.
you
And
don't. No.
also with, and I know you'll get into these, but with a feeling can be a point of attention. So I can recreate a feeling or deliberately modulate on a feeling of, I don't know, of my dog. The
How do
feeling
your
of
dog
petting
make you
my
feel?
dog.
Yes,
Yeah, my dog's been long gone, but I can recreate that feeling
You can.
in me deliberately and use it as a point of attention.
yes. And I will be able to explain all of that physiologically and in a way that isn't mystical one iota. The reason that you're able to remember the feeling of your dog is something that we would call emotional memory. And it's a part of what psychology calls emotional intelligence.
And the only reason this came up is because William mentioned that that's assuming that there are points of attention around you, so they don't have to be external. That's the only reason why I brought it up. There's some
That's a good
really
point.
great books by a couple of them were men that I know of who were in jail for a long period of time and often in isolation, and how they maintained their sanity by choosing points of attention, telling stories in their mind, imagining being married to Halle Berry, and they had a whole wonderful 10-year relationship, and this guy was in a cell the whole time. So those points of attention were really important to keep him balanced in a very imbalanced situation.
And we'll talk about redirection later, but when you mentioned Halle Berry, now I got to redirect. Dang it. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So what Donna's differentiating is that, yes, we do usually begin with the 5 senses. That's typically going to be beginner mindfulness, the basic and the foundation. We do go into introspective attention. That's a more psychological term for internal. And when I ask Tai Chi people, or other martial art people, not typically external styles, basically what it boils down to for me is the way that they train. That's pretty much how I view internal and external, is how do they train? Are they training more physical? Is it more like push-ups and all of these different types of exercises, or is it a little bit of a different, it can still lead to push-ups and doing all of that stuff, but it typically has a different beginning point in terms of the way that it's delivered. But I don't, when people talk about like, oh, you're really sensing internally, or you're doing things from the inside out, I like it, but sometimes they can't describe it all in detail. And especially using, anatomy and things like that. It's like, okay, so you don't know what you're talking about. That's okay. That's fine.
For our intents and purposes, if it's a point of attention that we can choose to point our flashlight of
Yes.
attention on, emphasize it, and
Yes.
extend that, maintain that emphasis,
Absolutely.
then it works.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good, clear explanation of active. I mean, when I said that about a point of something that's in your present, but I understand completely that
Mhm.
it's active, meaning you're choosing to hold an attention on a particular, whether it's an emotion, a feeling, a thought, an actual object but it's something that you're doing actively. So
Right.
I clearly understand that.
Okay, cool. All right, so we'll
Thank
move
you.
on. Yeah, you're welcome. All right, and Mike just joined us. We have 2 mics now. All right, so Michael, you just joined, but we're reviewing the teacher training. So this isn't necessarily how things would be delivered to an individual. That's actually one of the things about this system is that should be somewhat unique to the individual, how you deliver it. So even if it's in a classroom, we have ways to make a classroom meet people where they are. It's called a group study. It's a really great way for a class or a group to still meet each other exactly where we are and go from there. But so do one-on-ones. That's really where one-on-ones shine, is because you can give a lot of unique individual attention. This practice is delivered individually. When Donna delivers to somebody who has been studying these types of things for 20 years and somebody who has never sensed into their body a day in their life, that's going to be 2 different approaches to sharing the information. Does that make sense? I would never really imagine the bridge being taught like in a classroom with a chalkboard, and other than teacher training like this, I think it could work, but or in a webinar type of setting, it could work. But okay, so the first principle of this system, well, it's not the first, it's not this, I didn't put this in any particular order, it's just stuff I wanted to talk about today, I guess. And we'll add some more when we meet next Tuesday as well. But so the first and foundational theory of the system is asset. So moving on, this is a tricky one, but it is absolutely critical, the principle of balance. And the principle of balance is the one that people love to argue, and I did too. You know, I have a very active devil's advocate. So I have a voice that is very skeptical of everything, and it's a healthy skepticism. It's, you know, questioning the nature. Well, are you just doing this? Are you hustling yourself? These were questions that I asked myself, and it's the way that this system, and I was like, you know what? I'm not active. Like, I'm telling myself I'm active, but then I'm still just thinking, I'm still just doing this stuff automatically. I'm not active at all. And that's that voice in my mind saying, are you sure this is active, Ernest? Like, is this really, you know, what you're talking about? So I have a very active devil's advocate in my mind. And it's been super important and beneficial for me because it helps me not hustle myself and go down rabbit holes of things that just don't add up for me. So the principle of balance is definitely unique to the individual. This is where devil's advocate comes in, and they'll say, well, Ernest, balance is relative. And of course it is. William's balance in terms of different things that he can do physically are different than Donna and I probably, and I'm probably different than Ida, and we all have different balances. You know, homeostasis is a form of your body's balance, and that's going to be different for every individual. I think we can agree that there is a wildly relative nature to balance. However, balance can be felt. And this is where we start to get into empirical and theoretical representations. So if you've ever been on a skateboard and you're losing your balance, you know exactly what that feels like. Nobody has to tell you, nobody has to talk about it. If you're on a bicycle for the first time, you're struggling to find your balance. It's relative as shit. I get it. Balance is relative. But you're feeling out of balance or in balance. Does that make sense? So once you are skateboarding and you're counterbalancing and you find your balance and you're like, ooh, now I'm really rolling here, or you're on your bicycle and you really start to gain some momentum and you're now balanced. The fun thing about balance is it's never stagnant. There's micro adjustments. So even when you're on that skateboard, it's not like you're just, you know, completely rigid and you're not doing anything and you're like, I'm balanced. No, you still have to do a little bit to maintain your balance. A lot of that can be the body's, you know, automatic responses to, because we're doing it all the time. If you stand on 2 feet, especially if you stand on 1 foot, close your eyes, you can feel your body doing its little counterbalancing. You can feel the weight just basically shifting a little bit back and forth to maintain. So if you're surfing and you're balanced, you're still deliberate, you're still active, you're still riding that wave and doing these little counterbalances. Does that make sense? And if you lose your balance, you know what that feels like. And if you fall, you know what that feels like. But if you are counterbalancing and you regain your balance, you also know what that feels like. So one of the primary principles regarding balance is that it can be felt. And if you're really paying attention and you're honest with yourself, there's no way that you can hustle yourself, especially when you're really practicing and the lens of perception gets very clear. You know when you're out of balance and when you're not. So it is very relative, it is very unique, it is very individual, and you will know whether you're balanced or not if you really pay attention with a clear lens of perception. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, yes, did you have any questions? Okay, so, but now here's the thing. This is one of the founding principles and aspects of the way that I interact with my life experience, my mind, and this practice, is that we're not looking to alternate between extremes. And that's what the world does. When I first started doing Tai Chi, these teachers kept telling me that you need to be totally relaxed, fully relaxed, absolutely relaxed, 100% relaxed. I'm like, well, now wait a second. Physiologically, how do I stand if all of my muscles are relaxed? How can my body move if all of course, they weren't sharing a more accurate interpretation, which is the muscles that you're not using are relaxed. So it's efficiency is what we're looking for. We don't want to waste energy with unnecessary muscular tension. That's not what they were telling me. So I'm like, okay, we want to go from fully tense to fully relaxed. Let me try that. Of course, I never got there because there's no such thing. So oftentimes we look in the world and we see ego. And the way that I define ego isn't a good thing or a bad thing. It's just your memories, your likes, your dislikes, your name, your hopes, your aspirations. The self is the ego. Too much ego, no ego. They're both equally imbalanced. You're trying to eliminate something. And somebody like Eckhart Tolle, he has said it himself that he has seceded his ego, that the ego is gone. I bet if I say, hey, Eckhart, he's going to turn around. He's going to identify his name and he's going to turn around and I'll say, tell me about your past. He'll tell me about his past or not, but he has a past. He still has an identity. He might not be attached to it. He might not be clinging to it. He might have found balance with it. But let's not pretend that a person will ever not have a self, because you do. You have memories. Memory is a part of the self. So if you have any memory whatsoever, that is an aspect of you. It's an aspect of yourself. It's an aspect of your ego. Does that make sense? And I'm using ego, ironically, the way that Eckhart Tolle delivers it, not so much the way that Anne Freud delivered it. Of course, Sigmund stole all of Anne's ideas and published them. Does that make sense? So there's so many things in the world. One of the ways that I learned this is I was reading the Heart Sutra, and it was Buddha talking to his, disciples, and he said, Dharma is the same as no Dharma. You have to have an attachment to your identity to seek either one of them, and it's still a focus. So when you're focusing on not Dharma, you're focusing on Dharma. You're still focusing on the same thing. So this system is a system of balance. We're not trying to go from one type of thinking to another type of thinking. We're not trying to eliminate ego or secede these things. It doesn't make any sense. We're looking for a happy medium between them to where we're not clinging and attaching to them, but to deny something requires an equal amount of energy as almost as unconsciously indulging it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have a question. So when we talk
Of
about
course.
balance in a physical sense, we can have a
Yes.
clear understanding of what balance is, because
Yes.
we're in relationship to not being able to stand upright or maintain our structure.
Yes.
But when we're talking about balance in a more internal way, but with all our capabilities of our mind, our emotions, our feelings,
Right.
how are we defining balance at that point?
So we're defining it as not existing in extremes. So
Not existing in extremes.
one extreme would be to deny, and the other would be to indulge.
And also the concept that it's a dynamic
It is a
thing,
dynamic,
because it's
yeah.
changing. Nothing is stagnant.
Right.
Really, nothing stands still. And so balance is a constant accommodation.
Yes. Habit. The mind is always creating a new habit. It's designed to. That's the mind's design. It wants to keep you safe. It wants active memory. It doesn't want to have to relearn how to drive a car every time you approach a steering wheel. So it wants to compartmentalize It wants to create a certain degree of habit, and a certain degree of habit is okay to a certain extent. It's when that habit gains momentum because it's just unconscious for so long that it starts to get out of balance. And before you know it, we're clinging and attaching and suffering and everything else because of that attachment. So, you know, this system focuses a lot on habit because for a lot of people, if your mind isn't active, you don't even know what's habit and what's not because you're not paying attention. So I'm not trying to eliminate habit. I'm also not going to unconsciously indulge habit. I'm going to pay attention. And when I feel that habits are taking me out of balance, I redirect. Does that make sense? So I will never stand up here and say, I have no ego, I have no habit, I have achieved, I have arrived. That I will never say that.
So for an example, a habit taking you out of balance would mean a habitual act that's leading you towards an extreme.
Yes. And it very likely has unconscious momentum. So in the lives of most people, it has years and decades of accumulated momentum. And it's like a force. It feels like a force. You know, if you have the habit of, oh, what are habits that people do? I don't know. Maybe, oh, I don't know. But if you have a really strong habit and it gains momentum.
A simple habit I find that, and it's not years, but just to click Facebook on my phone.
Exactly.
At times I'll do it and I'll click out and click right back in. It's like I'm like, what am I doing? And I realize that this is I've developed a habit, you know.
Exactly. And so, and now you start to feel that that's taking you out of balance.
Right.
Now it's time to redirect, go back to the practice. That habit is not serving us.
Right.
And it's out of balance when we haven't actively chosen it. It falls below consciousness.
Mhm.
You automatically do it. You even questioned yourself. Your voice of power said to you, "What am I doing? Why did I do that? I didn't actively choose to click on my phone. I did it out of habit." So but that's awareness. And so as soon as you became aware and then chose to actively do something different, you're in the practice.
Yes. And Lauren, below recognition is a term that psychology uses rather than subconscious now, because subconscious started to go down weird paths that couldn't be explained and it couldn't be, you know, experimented on or proven. So, but we do know that the mind is always functioning with both, a balance, hopefully, of recognition and below recognition. Below recognition is typically using things like memory and all of that. So there are things in your room right now, Lauren, that you're not actively paying attention to, but your mind and your body may still be aware of.
So are habits just would that be falling that below recognition?
Habit is below recognition.
Below
yes.
recognition.
And if you recognize it and then do a habit, that's different. That's a choice. The moment that you become aware of a habit and still perform the habit, you have now chosen that. So it's not necessarily habitual. You're now choosing to do the act. And yeah, so behavioral change comes in the fourth layer of this system. We will talk directly about behavioral change. Clinging to a desire can absolutely become an extreme, because how are you clinging to that desire? You're very likely doing it psychologically by thinking about it. And that thinking is the number one thing that's imbalanced in the one of the number one things that's imbalanced in the human experience is the sheer volume of thought. Again, so that's another example. I'm not looking for no thought. I don't want to just sit here and never have a thought again in my life. My brain's able to do it. It's a beautiful thing about the human experience. However, I want thinking to be deliberate. I want it to be balanced. I want it to be in proportion. And in the world today, it is not. People are thinking almost all of the time. It's usually repetitive, habitual, and it's the same thoughts that they thought yesterday and the day before. When you're thinking about your problem, stop for a moment and look, how often, how many times have you thought this exact same shit? Does that make sense, Lauren? I would say the word clinging is when it has gained momentum and we no longer want to, we're starting to identify with it. It's now, that's a part of us. And people do that all the time. They do that with symptoms. They do that with, you know, aspects of their personality. I remember the day when, oh, and it's likely, yeah. We'll talk about that more with the lens of perception and where desire comes from. Is it being led by the destroyers, or is it being led by commonalities in the human experience, such as creativity? Creativity is a common desire for us all. That's why we feel so good when we're creating. Okay, I think all that makes sense. So, imbalances will be a tricky one to discuss with people. You know, that is one of the tricky ones because it does have a relative nature to it. And you can't tell me about my balance. No, I'm not trying to. You have to pay attention. What is taking you in and out of that little circle that we call the hydrostasy bubble? Because even balance, like Donna mentioned, it's not stagnant. It's not as if you've arrived and you're not doing anything and you're just riding this wave of No, we're in a world today that you have to adapt to maintain balance. It is constantly throwing shit at us. So unless acted on by an outside force, and we are constantly being acted on by an outside force. And that's not an excuse. We just have to be present, aware, and adapt to these things using the practice. Okay. Things like perfection, that's imbalanced. I've never met a perfect person. I've never met anybody who walks on water. I've never met anybody who, I hear all of these things in these groups about these masters and they can do all of this shit, but they died when they were 80, just like all the other people who died when they were 80. They had problems and not problems and likes and show me what's different. Like, show me what's really different. I'm not seeing it. I think all of those things can be achieved with very simple principles and practice and time, you know, momentum. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We can get on with this. So this is an embodiment theory, and this is an embodiment practice, and it's one of the foundational principles. Is that, and I love Donna's clarification that it's a commitment to embody. It doesn't imply that you're always doing it. Eventually it will, of course. But if you are embodying something, it means that you are committed and giving an effort to remember this practice. So, you know, if Shana says, I want to start embodying this practice, it doesn't mean that from now on, she's going to be completely present all day long and active points of attention.
Or if she's not failing.
And if she's not doing it,
she's just decided to make a commitment to a practice.
Exactly. And one of the things that we used to talk about that is necessary is the unbending desire to feel peace. And peace is a mind that's not at war with itself. I love definition. Very rarely will I use a word that I can't explain. So people use the word inner peace, peace all the time. What is that? It's the feeling of a mind that's no longer fighting itself and fighting its present moment. Enlightenment. It's not a destination. It's not a place. It's not an achievement. It's when the mind feels that lightness because it's no longer encumbering itself. That requires context. You had to have an encumbered mind to feel the enlightened mind. Hopefully someday we have a society that doesn't even have a word for peace and enlightenment because they didn't create the inner war and the inner struggle in the first place. I have hope. Okay, so embodiment is a critical component of this practice. And when I was giving the whiteboard, I'll go back to the whiteboard. The third pillar, this is what makes it embodiment, because this is maintaining emphasis. That's the third pillar, is to maintain emphasis. The first technique is to connect. The second technique is to emphasize. The third technique is to maintain emphasis. The other three techniques we'll talk about later. But this is the bulk of the system, is to connect. Here I am, come back to the moment. Emphasize something, point of attention, maintain emphasis. Maintain emphasis is the third pillar of this practice. And that's, I mean, we say third pillar all the time in our group studies. Go back to the practice, go back to the third pillar. And what we're saying is go back to maintaining emphasis. It is the maintaining that is the difference between this and mindfulness-based stress relief, because we're not just doing it when we're stressed. We're not just doing it when things aren't working out for us. We're not just doing it when shit's hitting the fan. We're doing it when we wake up. We're doing it when we eat breakfast. We're doing it when we use the restroom, when we take a shower, in absolutely every act that we do. Hopefully, ideally. And if you're not failing, you've just forgotten and you'll remember later. And that's a part of it. Pretty simple there, right? Any questions about embodiment? Yeah.
I think structurally, if I were teaching this, I would write it down. I would put first pillar, second pillar,
Oh, yeah.
third pillar.
Sure.
Next to it, presence, mindfulness, deliberate intention.
Mhm.
And next to that, here I am, where is my mind, engage.
Yeah.
And next to that, connect, emphasis, maintain. I mean,
Connect, emphasize,
that's what we're
maintain.
talking about.
That's what we're talking
I
about.
would write that out just like that.
That sounds great. Go ahead and write that out and send it to me.
You got it.
And actually, that's how I have it in my mind. Like when I think of it or I imagine it written out like that, it's in these categories because we're talking
Of
about the
course
same
you
thing.
do, but that's so old news to you that you forget that it's so foundational. It's something I picture and I still say, here I am, where's my mind? What am I doing? Like I still do those basic foundational things that you taught me 4 or 5 years ago. So
Yeah.
And we've changed some of the way that we say it, but it's all the same. So just
It is.
referring to third pillar for somebody just coming in,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you don't get lost, but I mean, that structure helps me in my brain.
For sure. Yeah. It helps to apply the practice when it's more organized like that and you're working with it in that fashion. I get that. Okay, so from embodiment, we talk a lot about the lens of perception. I could actually have an entire webinar on this. The lens of perception is so important to the human experience. So imagine it literally like a lens, and you have attention that's going through the lens. It will always be altered once it goes through that lens. That's what lenses do. They alter the light. Does that make sense? And then what comes out of that lens is a result of the lens. The lens of perception has everything to do with your mind, your body, your actions, your beliefs, the things that you do. All of that is your lens of perception. Clean that lens of perception, everything changes. If the lens of perception remains this automatic, habitual thing, pretty much everything going through that lens is going to have that residue of habitual, of automatic, of conditioned. Does that make sense? So one of the things that we're learning to do in this system is to really clear the lens of perception of repetitive habitual thinking. And when that lens of perception clears up, all of the virtues arrive on their own. We never need to focus on the result, because once the lens of perception clears, all the results will occur on their own. I don't prefer the word virtue. I like the word result, because virtue implies beneficial, and I get that. This does all feel beneficial, but just to keep it a little bit more scientific, it's just a result. It's the action or the cause and the effect. So we have cleansed our lens of perception, which means what? You're not thinking all the time. You're not as habitual all the time. You're really engaging your present moment. You're really active in your present moment, and you're starting to feel some of these virtues. One of the reasons this is important is because throughout my studies for the last, 20 or 30 years, there's always this run-in with what the philosophers in antiquity had so much struggle with is morals. So that's the big aspect of a lot of Buddhist teaching with Dharma, the way, the right way that we should do things. Now, this is a little bit of a hypothesis. I need more proof. I need more evidence. But it is my belief that when we just get out of our own way using this practice, we become more kind, we become more compassionate, we become more caring, we become more involved in our communities and the things around us, because we're not muddled down. Our lens of perception isn't muddy with all of our unconscious desires, all of the focuses and all of the habits and all of the junk. Once we start to dissolve. I like the word dissolve. We're not eliminating. But once we start to dissolve some of those aspects of our own psychology, the lens of perception gets more clear. And then before you know it, I don't want to be mean to a person. I don't like how that feels. I don't like how it makes the other person feel. So oftentimes in the ancients, they wanted to figure out how can we get somebody to be virtuous? How can we get somebody to be, I mean, that's the reason that religions were created, is because we want to modify people's behavior in a way that is more conducive to a society. At least that was perhaps the original intention of some religions. Maybe others are just straight up control. But Donna, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that we don't really, we don't dissolve things. Things dissolve as a result of what we're doing.
Exactly, the
And-
lens of perception.
And I think that distinction is important, and I know that's what you mean, but
Yeah.
I think the distinction is important because you can't not do something.
True.
You can't not do something. You can only do something.
Right.
So if we are focused on our deliberate intention, and if we are aware of the result as a feeling of peace, a mind unencumbered by itself, then we navigate our circumstances differently.
Mhm.
And as a result of that, things dissolve.
Yes.
Our worrying about what others are thinking, our worrying about whether we're dressed appropriately, the circumstance, our all of the things that get in the way of a peaceful mind.
Mhm.
It's those things dissolve as a result of our lack of attention on them.
True.
And so when I feel any of, that's
agree.
why I go by feeling a lot. And it's not woo-woo, it's
Mhm.
very scientific.
Mhm.
If I feel uncomfortable in a circumstance, I'm usually uncomfortable with the way another is behaving. I'm judging something, or I'm feeling persecuted or excluded, or whatever the hell I'm feeling. If I don't feel well, I am probably not practicing.
Probably
Or
not.
I am practicing only to a degree.
Mhm.
I'm practicing, I might be noticing the color green, but my teeth are gritting and I'm not in balance.
Right.
And
Yes.
so I think the reason you're assuming that the nature of man is to be kind and generous and function as a whole well together. So when your mind is at peace, which means you're practicing, those other things dissolve. So
Right.
it's not trying to change your behavior to be more moral. It's trying to
Exactly.
allow the morality to come to the surface by focusing and the other things dissolving
Right.
in the absence of our attention on them.
Right. And the point of creating the lens of perception as a principle is so that we don't focus on trying to change. How do you focus on trying to change? Typically through thought, because you're thinking about it. So now you're just emphasizing the thing that you want to maybe push past or eliminate. And so you're still emphasizing it. And if I want to actively ignore, that's actively emphasizing the object I want to ignore. That you're not ignoring anything. You're emphasizing it. You're calling it ignoring because you're looking the other direction and you're like, I'm not talking to you, I'm ignoring. No, you're not. You're actively paying attention to me in the present moment. That's not ignoring at all. So the lens of perception is a principle that helps us to not focus on results and not, we need to try to be more moral. We need to try, because all we're going to do is do the practice. The lens of perception will clear up on its own, and you'll just start to notice some of these things. Now, the reason, yes.
I was going to say, and here's where the principle of the hawk comes in. So I know
Good
you
point.
said it's an active,
Yeah.
it helps me when I am in a situation and I notice myself being pulled in that unbalanced direction of judgment and or being annoyed or put off by another's behavior, is remembering, I like looking at the principles at play, because those are things I can navigate, because I can
Sure.
only change
Yeah.
this. This is the only thing I can change.
Right.
So when I notice that I'm feeling that, then and one of my choices of attention that day is to notice the principles at play. I can notice that the principle of the hawk, his version of his perception is different than mine.
Mhm.
His degree of practice is different than mine based on that perception, that filter. And so that person sees things differently than I do. Period. End of story.
Mhm.
Like, I don't need to go any further than that. And if it really is still annoying me, then I need to redirect completely my
Right.
attention elsewhere.
Yeah, and remember that one of the key characteristics of Principle of the Hawk, we'll talk about that one later, is that neither perception is more right, more true, more correct. The hawk sees the same cornfield that I do, but it sees it with its hawk eyes, its hawk ears, its hawk senses. I see it with my human ears, my human senses, and neither interpretation is more correct. And so it kind of just dissolves that competitive type of thing.
And the totality of the experiences of those two beings up until that point.
Right.
The trauma, the whatever happened in this situation before, all of that is individual.
Right. So in a lot of so the bottom line is the reason the lens of perception is there is because if you're focusing on changing something, or if you're focusing on certain things, you're actually emphasizing it, and you're not probably being mindful at all. You're not doing your practice. So it doesn't make sense to do that. If you have character, I'm going to put this in air quotes, but things that you want to change, flaws, just keep doing the practice. Just keep focusing on your practice, keep feeling into the practice, and the lens of perception will start to change and focus itself, and then the results. Now, here's one of the reasons that I view kindness and things like this as something that must be a part of the human species, is because it's functional to work together. The way that we interact with our minds creates dysfunction across the species. And if it's dysfunctional across the species, that means that we're creating that, because a species wouldn't naturally do anything that's dysfunctional for its own procreation and its own, evolution or change over time. So if we're beating the shit out of each other, if we're beating each other down, if we're killing each other, if we're persecuting each other, if we're trying to control each other, none of that is an efficient method of a species to exist. So it must be a result of psychological dysfunction. If the psychological dysfunction isn't there, what's left? Kindness, collaboration, understanding, patience, the virtues that people talk about. They will come forth on their own without trying to control, without trying to manifest them. Just go back to the practice. Does that make sense? Okay, and we'll get into all of that more, but these are some of the foundational things that if you took this away, it changes the whole bridge system, because that's what a lot of other systems do. They say, all right, you want to quit smoking? Let's focus on smoking, and let's focus on quitting smoking. And then before you know it, you need hypnosis, because it's just the focusing on the act is very difficult to redirect the act. Does that make sense?
Yeah, William just spoke about before. I clicked on my phone and I clicked off my phone, and then I went, wait a minute. He brought his awareness to his behavior, and so his behavior is going to change as a result of that
Automatically.
awareness, not because he decided to focus on how much am I using my phone.
Exactly.
Let me see. Let me keep a log about how many times I go in, how many times am I actually
Exactly.
spending time on media. Oh, the media is the enemy, and then it becomes a whole, different
thing.
thing. It's just
A whole different
awareness. It's just awareness. That's it.
And by the way, we're using the word awareness. It means recognition. Awareness and recognition are synonyms. So if you are aware of something, you are recognizing it in your present moment. If you're deep in thought and somebody's sneaking up behind you, you are not aware of them. There's no recognition. Yes.
I'd like to add on to what Donna was saying, is that, and then aware of the feeling associated with that is very helpful, because just using that example is that, yeah, I don't log, I to manage that whole social media thing, I don't log any of that. I have friends who tell me, oh, I have an app on my phone that keeps track of, and I'm just like, you know what, I'm keeping track of how I feel when I come to the realization that I'm doing things without thought, and that there's something happening inside of me that is happening faster than I'm recognizing it. And then I start bringing my attention to the feeling of what is that about, and that has helped me tremendously, just with simple things like that. But I can kind of expand that whole simple thing to other things in my life that still have that same kind of habitual pattern.
Right. Absolutely. And we'll always be working on this lens of perception. So there's no perfect lens. So this eliminates the perfection, image. There's no image of perfection. There's no person who's just going to completely master all of this and now they're, you know, leveling up or ascending, or I don't know about any of that. Maybe I put that on the island of possibility, and I also put it on the island of I don't care. I care more about how I feel. Am I balanced? Am I functional? Am I being beneficial to other human beings? What are the ripples I'm leaving in the water of time and my experience? Are they ripples that I can be proud of, or are they unconscious, habitual, conditioned ripples that I don't even know what it looks like because I'm not paying attention?
And connection, the feeling, William just brought off, what does it feel like? And I know when I'm practicing, I feel more connected to my experience. I feel more
Yeah.
connected to other people. I feel more connected to my life.
Sure. And we'll get into feeling a little bit more another time, because that's
I
another
just
class.
meant connection. Connection
Yeah,
was
yeah.
the point that I wanted to bring. It's
For
a
sure.
virtue of the practice.
Right. And again, when we talk about virtue, we're talking about the lens of perception. Our lens of perception is being altered because of our practice. And we don't have to try to be virtuous. We don't have to try to be kind. The more that we do this practice, these things will naturally occur, because it's more functional for a species to work together. It's more functional for a species to not kill one another or hurt one another or want to take advantage of one another. And we start to see this more clearly. So when I talk about seeing things clearly, it's because that lens of perception is no longer dirty with all of our habit, momentum, all of our conditioning, all of our below recognition interaction with our life experience. There are some people who are below active recognition for their entire day, if not their entire week, their entire month, their entire year. They're below the level of active recognition. But like Donna said, they're still driving, they're still doing their work, they're still interacting with their experiences and the things that they do, because it's all below the level of active recognition.
They're
On a
still
top.
producing. They're producing.
Absolutely. They're still creating. That's, you know, creation.
Yeah,
That's
the funny
another
part.
reason. Yeah. And that's another reason I look at creation as a principle, because whether you do it actively or not, you're still creating something. Absolutely. All right. Now we're going to get into also one of the reasons that people quit. And this just comes from experience. These are the things that when I talk about to people, they're like, this was too hard. I don't like this. This doesn't make sense. I'm going to go back to whatever. No, it's not mindfulness. Sorry. That's the next slide, but that's not what I thought was coming next. We'll skip mindfulness because we're getting a little bit short on time, but mindfulness is defined. I use Thich Nhat Hanh's definition. I will use some of the popular definitions, but the bottom line is that it's the mind that is paying attention to the present moment without necessarily creating thought streams about it. You're not judging it. You're not, you know, labeling, comparing, compartmentalizing, trying to figure it all out. Now, the thing about mindfulness, the way that I share it, is simply the more that you actively pay attention to the present moment on purpose, the more that mindfulness will occur. Because I gave the example that if you're lost in thought, somebody can sneak up behind you. The more you're engaging the world around you, the less you can think. You can't do both simultaneously. Well, you can, but not to a good degree, right? It's like a slider. The more I pay attention to the world, the less I think, because I only have so much attention to give the present moment. The more I think, the less I can give attention to the present moment, because I'm the flashlight of my attention has turned in on thought. It's no longer shining into the environment or into the body, because it's just churning and paying attention to the thinking mechanism. I don't know if this is a spoiler, but when you think, you're paying attention to it. Every thought that a person has ever thought, the flashlight of their attention is paying attention to it to some degree or another. And they could still be driving while they're doing that. They can still be doing work while they're doing that. They can still be having sex while they're doing that. All that makes sense? Okay, so, you know, going through mindfulness very quickly, the big point about the mindfulness is that by paying attention to the environment, words will relax. We don't have to even focus on relaxing words necessarily. Just do the practice. Words will reduce. And then, you know, we use thought to relax thought. The way that I started to relax in Tai Chi is by thinking. And if I said that on a Tai Chi forum, they would say that I'm crazy and I don't know what I'm talking about and that that's stupid. No, when I was doing Tai Chi and I found myself thinking, rather than just trying to not think, I used my thought deliberately. I would pay attention to the world around me. I would remind myself that I don't have to be perfect. And this is brought out in my book, The Voice of Power. We can use our voice to go back to the practice. We can use our voice to talk out what we're doing. And as long as you're choosing to do that, you've just added the deliberate nature to thought, and that will still help thought reduce because it's no longer habitual. You're doing it on purpose. So when I would do Tai Chi, I would remind myself that I'm doing this because I want to feel better, not because I want to impress somebody. Maybe I find myself comparing with another Tai Chi master or somebody who's been doing it the same. I don't need to compare, just relax, feel your body. I'm talking to myself in a productive way. Does that make sense? A lot of this practice is talking to yourself in a productive way, which will naturally help thought reduce because we don't typically do that. Does that all make sense? Yes, William.
Yeah, I would, and not to get off on a tangent, and,
Mhm.
and I'm trying to minimize that so we can be making the most of the time. But the thing with Tai Chi is that, yeah, there's a lot of people who misunderstand
Mhm.
and this whole idea about what the mind should be doing when they're
Mhm.
practicing. But from my introduction to Tai Chi in the many years I've trained, I was never instructed to not have any thought or to just relax. That even my instructor, one of my primary instructors, one of his things is that, yeah, you have to give your mind something to do to get to the point that it's not going to do anything. And I used to be like, what does that mean?
No,
You're like, well, I try to tell you, just don't, you give yourself something to work with, and then you can expand, and maybe that'll become less. And, but I've always understood that as a foundation, that the mind is a very much part of the practice.
Mm-hmm. That is actually, that's almost exactly what Donna was saying with you can't not do something. So just, you have to do something deliberately because you can't not think, right?
Do something deliberate, right?
Do something deliberate, exactly. Okay, now let's go to the one that will be the result, the main reason people quit is redirection technique. The redirection technique is the primary technique with the third pillar. How do you maintain emphasis? The primary way to maintain emphasis is to be committed to the rule of three and the redirection technique. If a person doesn't do the redirection technique, this practice could take decades to accomplish what could happen in a year if you did redirect. So redirection really ramps up in the third layer of training, but it starts in the second. I really want foundational training to not interact with redirection too much, because chances are if we're delivering foundational information, they're not going to be ready, very likely. I don't want to put anybody in a box. You'll have to discern that on your own. But typically, if a person is just now learning that about their thoughts and about, their mind and their body, and this is all new to them, they're going to have a really hard time paying attention enough to catch thoughts, enough to redirect thoughts back to the practice. So that I do view that as the next layer, which is called counterbalance, which is forgetting more than you remember, but you are remembering. So you're doing the practice, and that's the counterbalance phase. That's when I would typically start to introduce the redirection technique. And the redirection technique came from years of experience and trying things that people recommended. They're like, Ernest, when you feel like punching somebody, just breathe. And so I'm at the movie theater, somebody's complaining about the movie, they're getting verbally assaulting me, and I'm like, I still want to kick this guy's ass. Like I just want this. He has a very punchable and then of course I'm still thinking that he has a punchable face. I could just end this confrontation right now. Breathing wasn't enough. So doing one thing just didn't seem like it was enough. And I was learning what I mean by the word momentum. If you are angry, I can guarantee that there is a lot of momentum behind that anger, whether you realize it or not. And in order to redirect, this is Tai Chi principle, rather than be passive, I don't think passivity benefits me. So if I'm thinking a thought that is repetitive, habitual, and it's leading me away from inspiration, it's leading away from a clean lens of perception, it is not a beneficial stream of thought. I'm not doing anything right now except for being a dysfunctional human being with dysfunctional thought, reinforcing dysfunctional habit. And that doesn't benefit me. So I have to redirect. I don't want to be passive, but I also don't want to use a lot of energy and a lot of force. That could be like completely removing yourself from a situation. It could be removing other people from your situation because, oh, I just want Donna out of here. She's the problem. I'm going to get rid of Donna. Well, no, that's not how things work, because somebody else is going to be the new problem. Somebody else will just spring up in Donna's place and now they're the problem, because it's a habit. It's a habit of creating problems and looking at other people as being the culprit of those problems. That's all just a habitual stream of thought, a habitual way of behaving. So the redirection technique is using at least 3 points of attention, including self-talk. So in the situation with the person at the restaurant or at the movie theater, I had to excuse myself because I was still learning. So I did excuse myself. I went to wash my hands. I did some movement. That is a deliberate act. Point of attention 1. I usually do 4 or 5, but I think it's a minimum of 3. I'm moving, and then I'll use a mantra that I can relax, and then I
Well,
breathe.
the first one was rapid redirection. That was your first technique. You got up to go wash your hands.
Yeah, so rapid redirection is something that we introduce in the beginning when you feel like something is overwhelming, when you feel like it's just like, I can't, at least where I am right now, I'm not able to easily redirect it. I have to remove myself. So if you're feeling violent, probably need to remove yourself from the situation. That won't always be necessary. I don't rapidly redirect anymore. It's a tool that I'm ready to use. If I need to, if I see something that just takes me out of my balance, maybe I see an old lady getting beat up. Hey, I'm probably going to have a response to that it gets a little bit habitual. I don't know, but I might need to rapidly redirect. Does that make sense? Rapid redirection is a technique that we introduce somewhat in the beginning when you feel like you need to remove yourself from a situation to do your rule of 3.
Sure, a
But-
lot of people come to the practice because of what they've labeled as an anxiety disorder.
Sure.
And so when you feel your anxiety getting to a certain level where you're not
Rapidly
functional,
redirect.
or you're going
Yeah.
to cry or have a breakdown or whatever, or you embarrass yourself, you can rapidly redirect so that you can do what you were just about to explain.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then so technically the rule of 3 is 3 or more active points of attention. So it's a bunch of asset all at once to help redirect back to the practice. The more momentum the emotion and the thought stream has, chances are the more points of attention you're going to need. And when you're done with your rule of 3, you go back to maintaining emphasis. Some people would do the rule of 3 and go back to the unconscious mind. And it's like, well, you did interrupt the continuity of the below recognition behavior, the habitual behavior, which is good. That's great. We did a little interruption. But if you don't go back to maintaining a point of emphasis, you don't really go back to the practice. And this is the number one thing that people will either A, forget, B, not want to do, or C, quit because of. And it's also the thing that helps the most. So ironic.
Well, it's because they don't have the unbending desire for change
Maybe.
or for peace.
Yeah, maybe.
And also because there's still a lot of mind functioning that goes below consciousness.
Sure.
It's people come to a practice often because they have anxiety disorder or they have whatever, and they want to just be able to navigate that issue when it arises in that extreme.
Mhm.
They don't necessarily recognize that it is a practice of a way of life and not just to get them out of an extreme state of being.
Yes.
And the only way to really know that is to continue to practice. I mean, I was devil's advocate a lot in my own head in the beginning of this practice. And then until I got tired of hearing my own voice coming up with all the reasons why I don't see how that is beneficial to me. And I just do it, Donna, just do it, just practice it. What are you doing anyway? You come to class every day. We were meeting 3 times a week, sometimes more. And it's just do it and see how it works or doesn't work. And then bring those questions to class, because it's not functional to keep repeating these same arguments in your head. It's just not functional.
Right. And to Lauren's point, your entire life situation could potentially be an extreme. Absolutely. A lot of clinging, a lot of attaching, a lot of overdoing a wide variety of things. I noticed that when I would start to do Tai Chi or I would start to do these other things, I was like, man, why does everybody have Tai Chi bumper stickers, Tai Chi t-shirts, Tai Chi this, Tai Chi that? It's like, do Tai Chi when you wake up all the time till you go to bed. And I'm like, and then I asked my teacher, can we do too much Tai Chi? And he's like, of course, you can do too much of anything. So it's when I really started to realize that balance is the principle. And when we get into the third layer of the practice, it's called warrior training. We are seeking a different title, just because it'll be more presentable if we don't use certain terms. But the reason we call it warrior training is because I outlined exactly what needs to be redirected. I didn't do that in the previous section, in the previous layer. The reason I do that in warrior training is because a person has now started to transition to remembering more than they forget. So there's 4 layers: forgetting almost all the time, forgetting more than we remember, remembering more than we forget, remembering all the time. Does that make sense? So it's allowing for a person to be inconsistent. It's allowing for a person to be, it's allowing for them to forget, and it's okay. It's a part of the practice. It's just, that's where you are in your layers right now. And the reason they're called layers is because we don't level up. I'm still doing all of the basics. It's just I've gotten a lot of momentum in practice, so certain things are a little bit easier for me. That's the way skill works. That's the way practice works. You start something and you're like, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to do this. 10 years later, you're teaching people how easy it is to do, because you've learned, you've gotten better at it, you've found personal ways to engage it. And typically, if you really understand something, you can really share it in a wide variety of ways with a lot of examples. So the redirection technique is vital if a person wants to continue in this system. Warrior training will ask a person to redirect any time that they find themselves comparing and contrasting, compartmentalizing, trying to figure it out, focusing and judging other people. And then eventually we narrow it down to 2 things. And this is tricky, and a lot of people haven't really committed to their warrior training, and I get it. It's asking a lot, I guess, of the mind at a certain point, but to redirect any thought about yourself or another person. And when you start to do this, you're like, holy shit, all of my thoughts are about me, even the thoughts about other people. I think, Michael, we had a discussion about this not too long ago. How often are your thoughts about another person still tracing right back to you? Yes, William.
I think that that's challenging because that's the basis of what people do. Meaning that if you'd ask me to do that, you're asking me to stop doing everything I do. You're asking me to stop doing everything I do. Everything is about what I'm going to eat, what I have to accomplish, or how I feel about this person, or what's our future going to be together, or why did it didn't work out, or whatever people are trapped in. Yeah, that's, you're asking, for most people, that's their whole concept of how they navigate life, or at least a good amount of it, unless they're, yeah. So anyway, that's all I
No,
can say
you're
about
right. No, you're right. That's why I called it warrior training. That's why, but at a certain point, I call them the traps of thinking, because the vast majority of our thought is emphasizing our ego. Remember, we defined ego and self. It becomes imbalanced that we're thinking about. Does that mean you can never think about yourself? Of course not. We don't go from one extreme to the other. But when we're practicing this, what we're doing is we're really learning to realize and see how often we're thinking about ourselves. Oh, William, you're still muted.
I realize that we're still talking. Oh, I'm muted. I'm unmuted.
No, you're good. I can hear you.
Okay, I realize we're talking about habitual patterns. So yes,
Exactly.
I may need to concern myself about what I may think of what I'm going to eat, but I don't need to keep thinking about certain things that are just habitual.
Bingo.
Like just things. And it's funny, as I've been practicing, it's really interesting how much, just like when I have my points of attention, how much they get interrupted, and I catch myself in some story I'm making up, or some like just habitual thought about things. And it's like, wow, I have so limited, you have less control than you think and that's not the word, but you have less ability to maintain awareness than you think you do, and until you give yourself points of attention.
Absolutely.
Then you really see how much you just repeat the same things over and over that really don't have to be resolved, or there's no resolution to, or anything like that. But it's just habitual. And so it does sound daunting to think that I would redirect every thought that's about myself or another. But I understand that it's in the scope of, yeah, you might need to think about what you're going to eat and make a decision and then move on. And now those are more like other things, but that's not where people probably spend most of their time. They're thinking about a whole bunch of other things, about things that they really aren't really acting on anyway, and that they're not going to resolve, or stuff like that. So
Exactly. The vast majority of those thoughts are about themselves, and it has nothing to do with the room that they're in. Has nothing to do with the moment that they're in. How am I going to get to vacation? How am I going to make this person happy? How am I going to make this person like me? How am I going to get this money? How am I going to get these items? How am I going to, and on and on and on and on and on and on. And all of that is an unnecessary focus on oneself. So when we get to the warrior training, if somebody truly commits to it, it's like you said, you start thinking about yourself and you're like, no, wait a second. I don't have to do that. I'm going to use my rule of 3. I'm going to redirect back to my practice, and I'm just going to eat. I'm going to open up the refrigerator, pull out an apple, and just go ahead and eat an apple, because that's what I want. That's how I can get closer to that desire without, all the muddiness of that thinking and the repetitiveness and the habit. And another aspect is it really shows a person, if they do this practice for a little while, it will really show them the sheer volume of thought, because we're looking for balance. We're not looking to never think about yourself. They'll see how much they're removing themselves from the present moment, removing themselves from their own practice to go back into thought that's just about yourself, your likes, your dislikes, your wants, your desires, your memories, your hopes, your aspirations, the things that hurt you, being offended, all of these things. It's not necessary to let that gain momentum, to let it become an unconscious habit. And then before you know it, here's a habit that I have. I say have, because it's not something that's completely gone away, taking things personally. So there's often times where, when did this happen most recently? I can't remember when this happened most recently, but there was a situation and I started to, oh, I wonder if this is me. And I'm like, wait, this is the habit. This is the habit of taking something that I don't know if it's about me and speculating. Did I do something? Is this my fault? Maybe this person's just having a bad day. Maybe they're just, it's totally 100% them. I don't know. So focusing on it and thinking about it and speculating on it is completely dysfunctional. It doesn't serve me, doesn't serve them. I don't really know for sure anyway. So I'm going to redirect using the rule of 3. Does that make sense? And it'll pop up every now and then. Maybe I go to work and somebody's acting strange and I'm like, oh my God, did I offend them? Did I say, Ernest, that's just your tendency to make things personal, to make things about you. Wait and find out. If this person's offended by you, they'll either tell you or they won't, but you can't force these situations. Does that make sense?
So it's a principle of habit and momentum.
Yes.
When you notice something, and is this about ego? It's like, you mean I'm not the center of the universe? But in the beginning of the practice, I discovered exactly what William was just speaking about, which is, wow, everything isn't about me. Like, it doesn't all come from me. This is just out of conditioning, habit, and momentum. Am I doing this? Opening the refrigerator and taking stuff out and sticking it in my mouth is a lot of habit and momentum. I wasn't really actually hungry. I was thirsty, but I saw food, so I stuck it in my mouth. Like, there's a lot of habit and momentum, and also ego. The taking everything personally. There's a lot of ego-based stuff. Instead of just being observational, we have to apply meaning to everything, and a lot of that is habit and momentum. And another important factor is 2 degrees. We do 2 degrees. We can't expect, if we've had a certain conditioning, expectation from our family, from our upbringing, from schooling, whatever. And there's a lot of habit and momentum in that direction that we're going to stop it in a second. It's like a snowball. If you catch the snowball before it rolls a third of the way down the hill, well, it'll be a lot easier to stop than if you're at the bottom of the hill and you need to try to stop that. Like, give yourself a break, just noticing it and making some choices that serve for a better balance is practicing. You are practicing 2 degrees. Eventually, those things will get smaller, have less pull for us, less momentum, but we're still practicing to whatever the results are. We are still practicing now. We have upset the setup. What we focus on tends to grow in our experience. So if we're focusing on the present moment and engaging it accordingly, the other things will dissolve in our absence of attention on them.
Absolutely. Yes, William.
Yeah, we have upset the setup.
Yeah, that was one of our favorite terms back in the day. Upset the
Okay.
setup.
Well, it's new to me and I like it. As a martial artist, you know, when a guy's about to set up a combination, he's set up to set
Yes.
his, you know, and so then you do something and now you've upset the setup.
You've
So
upset the setup.
I'll be saying that for a while probably.
You can have it. All right, cool. So I think that might be the last slide. Yeah, and then so we have foundational mindfulness, and that's the first layer. That's where we talk about a lot of the basic things, you know, what is thinking, you know, what is the human mind, what is the body, how do they interact with one another? Are they the same thing? How do we know if something's the same thing? How do we know if something's different? So there's scientific ways to look at that using geometrical proof. Can one exist without the other? Can the other exist without the one? They're not the same thing. Can they not exist without one another? Then they're a combination of the same thing as a whole. Now, the next part of the practice we call, okay, yeah, we're almost done here. So I'll just outline the 4 phases and then we can head on out, field any last questions. The second phase, all right, bye Donna, thank you. That second phase is what we call counterbalance. And counterbalancing is you forget more than you remember, and we introduce the rule of 3. Folks can start to work with the rule of 3 and counterbalance. Now they're doing it more often, and they're really starting to see this stuff for themselves, and they want to go into warrior training. Warrior training really focuses on redirection. And then a person starts to remember most or all of the time. And then we start to get into the final layer that I call hydrostasy. It comes from the term hydrostatic equilibrium, which is the ultimate example of balance, in my opinion, which is the sun, our atmosphere, our oceans are a result of this phenomenon that we call hydrostatic equilibrium. So it seemed fitting to use that term because that's also how it feels. I feel like a ball of sun when I'm really present and active and engaged and my mind is clear. So hydrostasy is less talk. Really all we talk about is technique at that point. This is also where I'll cut off how I talk about things. I don't divide up so the unseen, the energy, I don't divide that up. Once we start to approach that, I can't talk about it. You may have seen some of my posts in like Tai Chi Connection that there's just certain things that we really can't teach, we really can't talk about. We can introduce ways to get there on our own, and then we experience it. And then when we do want to talk about it, it's very artistic. It's very expressive because it's all feeling based in hydrostasy. And then ultimately, the system will sort of end. It comes to its conclusion when a person is embodying the rule of 3. I have learned to maintain up to 4 active points of attention almost at all times. It doesn't make me a super person. I haven't leveled up. I'm not really anything special, but wow, it's definitely different than the way I was living before. I'll just say that. This comes with a technique that I call the 4 directions of attention. I can maintain all 4 directions simultaneously. And we'll talk about that when we get into the hydrostasy section, and I can really outline some of the techniques. Mind gazing is a hydrostasy technique where you use the light of your attention to put awareness on different parts of your brain. All right, any questions about any of this? Some of the foundational principles that the system is built on. Mike, Jerry, any questions? Okay, yep. I'll see you next Tuesday, William, if you can make it, but thanks for hanging out. I appreciate it. Yep, see ya.
Thanks, Ernest.
You're welcome, Mike. Did you have any questions? Anything I need to clarify before we go?
All
right, bye, Lauren.
No, I think I've got it. Just sometimes I'm going, like you're talking about, I'm going back to the lag track, and I've got to redirect that shit. So
If you don't, it will continue. If you don't redirect it, what will it do? It will maintain its momentum and continue. So you have to redirect it. If you don't redirect it, we're being passive to our own habits. The biggest change for me came not from understanding shit, not from learning shit. It came from doing my rule of 3 as often as I can remember. That's warrior training.
gotcha. That's like the vigilant of recognizing it with awareness, so that you can use the technique to redirect it.
Well, yeah. It's about recognizing what's occurring in the moment. And if you recognize the thought, that's step 1, of course, but okay, you've recognized a repetitive stream of thought. What do you do with it? You redirect it using the rule of 3 back to the practice. One of the best ways to gauge this is this thought in any way a part of your present moment. Chances are it's not. Sometimes it is, and it's still not productive, but in general, the vast majority of our thoughts are removing us from the present moment. If that's occurring, that's a violation of principle. We need to bring it back.
Gotcha. Cool.
All right. Work with that for a little while and let me know.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, I will see everybody. Jerry, Michael, I'll see you guys again soon. We still have group study on Thursday if you could make it. All right. I'll see you guys.